This story is called the story of Heidi, who's a girl who lives in the mountains.
What's Heidi?
Heidi's a girl who lives in the mountains, the Swiss mountains. The first chapter is called Meeting Grandfather. Heidi felt cross and tired as Aunt Diti pulled her up the steep slope. "I'd go faster if I wasn't wearing all my clothes," said Heidi. "You'll need them at your grandfather's and I don't want to carry them," said her aunt angrily. "Do you think grandfather will want me?" Heidi asked nervously. Aunt Diti shook her head. "I don't know. He's a miserable old man. He hasn't seen you since you were a baby. But I've taken care of you for long enough now. Now it's his turn." At last they reached the grandfather's hut at the very top of the mountain. Diti rapped sharply on the door. It creaked open and an old man peered out. "What do you want?" he asked gruffly. "This is your granddaughter Heidi," Diti explained. "Your dead son's child. I brought her to live with you." "Take her away," said the grandfather. "I don't want her," said the old man, trying to shut the door. "I don't care," Diti snapped. "You have to take her. Both her parents are dead and I found a good job in Frankfurt and she can't come with me." With that, Heidi's aunt turned and ran down the mountain. Grandfather stared silently at Heidi. Heidi stared back. "He doesn't want me," she thought. She was very sad. "But where else can I go?" "Well, you'd better come in," said Grandfather with a scowl. Heidi stepped into the hut and looked around. There didn't seem to be room for her anywhere.
Yes, they're here.
No, that's Grandfather's bed.
Oh.
"Where shall I sleep?" she asked. Grandfather shrugged. He didn't even look at her. "You'll have to find your own bed," he growled.
But that's not your own bed.
Yeah.
That's his bed.
Heidi looked again and saw a ladder in the corner. Feeling curious, she climbed up into a hayloft. A hayloft is where all the hay is for the animals in the winter. From the window, she could see a green valley far below and hear pine trees whooshing in the wind. She lifted some of the sweeter smelling hay, puffing it up into the shape of a mattress. "I'll sleep here," she called. "It's lovely." "She shows some sense," Grandfather muttered to himself. "Come down now," he ordered. "It's time for supper." Heidi watched Grandfather blow onto the embers of the fire. Fetching a bowl, he filled it to the brim with rich, creamy milk. "Here you are," he said. Then he toasted bread and cheese over the fire until they were a glorious golden brown. Delicious smells filled the hut, and Heidi realized how hungry she was. She licked up oozing drips of cheese, crunched the toast, and drank the milk to the last drop. Through the open door, she saw the sky and mountainside glow in the setting sun. "I like it here, Grandfather," she said. That night, Heidi snuggled down in the hayloft. As she fell asleep, she wondered why Grandfather lived all alone high on the mountain. What had happened to make him so sad and unfriendly?
What's over for Freddy?
Unfriendly is somebody who's not very nice to you. He's not friendly. If you're friendly with somebody, you give them kisses, you hold them, you hug them. But if you're not friendly, you ignore them or don't talk to them or just don't play with them. So he was unfriendly. But he does say now he's getting better. He says to her as she goes to bed, "Good night, Heidi." "Good night, Heidi." The next chapter, chapter 2 this is called The Goat Boy. That's obviously about a boy who's got something to do with goats. Maybe he looks after goats. Let's see the story. Early next morning, Heidi woke to the sound of bells. She sat up. Sunshine poured through the hayloft window, turning her straw bed into glimmering gold. Quickly, she dressed and shot down the ladder. A boy was standing at the door whistling. "This is Peter the Goat Boy," Grandfather told her. "He's come for Little Swan and Little Bear." 2 goats, one white and one brown, pushed past him and sniffed Heidi. She giggled as they licked her hands. "Their tongues tickle," she said. "Do you want to come with me?" Peter shouted over the bleats and bells. "I'm going up the mountain to find fresh grass for them." "Can I?" Heidi asked Grandfather. "I suppose," he replied. "But have your breakfast first." He sat on a stool and milked Little Bear, that's one of the goats, and then he handed Heidi a bowl of fresh milk. Fresh from the cow's udder, not the goat's udder. "Come on," said Peter, as soon as she'd finished. "You can stay at the back and make sure none of the goats get lost." As they ran over the rocks to the mountain pastures, Peter showed Heidi the mountain's secrets. He pointed to an eagle's nest hidden in the craggy peaks and the spots where wild flowers grow. The mountain looked as if a giant had scattered handfuls of jewels over it. Heidi had never seen so many flowers. She picked great blue and yellow bunches for Grandfather.
What's that?
We'll get to it. Every day, Heidi went out with Peter and the goats. And every day, her cheeks grew rosier and her eyes more sparkly. Grandfather fed her crusty bread, tasty cheese, and Little Swan's milk. Don't forget, Little Swan is the goat. At night, he told her stories by the fire. Just like I'm telling you stories.
Why?
That's nice, isn't it? He must like her now. Heidi had never been happier until one morning when the door flew open and there stood Aunt Diti in a brand new dress. "I've come for Heidi," she announced. "I should never have left her with you in the first place." "No," cried Heidi, suddenly afraid. "I like it here. I want to stay with Grandfather." Diti ignored her. "I found a place for Heidi in Frankfurt," she told Grandfather. "Clara Caesarman, a little girl who's always ill, wants a friend to keep her company. If Heidi behaves," her aunt went on, "Mr. Caesarman will pay her and buy her some fine new clothes. It's a great chance for her." Grandfather had been looking crosser and crosser during this speech. "Take her away and spoil her then," he bellowed at Diti. "But don't bother ever coming back, ever." Ignoring Heidi's protests, Diti grabbed her arm and dragged her outside. As they left, Heidi saw Grandfather sitting alone, his head in his hands. I think he's sad to see her go.
But why? Why?
Well, he grew to like her, I think. "Poor Grandfather," cried Heidi, tears trickling down her face. "Come on, Heidi," said Diti, pushing her down the mountain. "I'm sorry I ever left you with that sad old man." "Why is he so sad?" asked Heidi. "He thinks the world is a bad place," her aunt replied. "First his wife died, then your father, his only child, wasted all his money and died too. But your grandfather's just made things worse for himself. He said there was only misery in the world and shut himself away up here. Forget him, Heidi. Think about Frankfurt. I'll never forget him, cried Heidi. It's for your own good, Diti declared, striding off. Heidi was quiet, but secretly she made a promise. One day I'll come back to him. The next chapter is called Heidi and Clara. It was a long journey to Frankfurt. The sun was beginning to set when they stopped before a grand house in a cobbled street. Diti pulled the bell. This is it, she muttered. A well-dressed servant opened the door and led them into a vast hall. Heidi felt very small and shabby.
What's this? What's that?
She felt even worse when the housekeeper...
What's that?
I think that might be her aunt. Is that her Aunt Diti, or is that the housekeeper? No, that must be the housekeeper. Heidi felt very small and shabby. She felt even worse when the housekeeper, Mrs. Rottenmeier, saw her. You look most unsuitable, she said to Heidi with a sigh. I suppose you'd better meet Clara. Clara lay on a heap of pillows in a frilly 4-foot poster bed. Her face was pale and the room was hot. Thank you for coming, Heidi, she said quietly. I'll like having company. I can't get out of bed. Why not? Asked Heidi. I've been sick and I'm still weak, Clara explained. I don't think I'll ever get better. No one should ever get better in this hot, stuffy room, Heidi thought. She ran over to a window and flung it wide open. The street below jostled with people, horses and carriages. Heidi could hear strange music mixed in with the clattering hooves and footsteps. That'll cheer Clara up, she thought, listening to the music outside. Leaning out, she saw a ragged boy with a street organ. A pair of kittens peeked out of his pockets. Heidi rushed downstairs and onto the street. Can you come here? She called, beckoning him over. There's someone I want you to play for. Moments later, they were both bounding up the stairs. Surprise! Shouted Heidi, throwing open Clara's door and letting in the ragged boy. Downstairs, Mrs. Rottenmeier, the housekeeper, was puzzled. She could hear singing, laughing, music, even kittens, and all coming from Clara's bedroom. What's going on in here? She shrieked as she stormed into Clara's room. How did this dreadful boy get in? She demanded. I'll blame you, she said, glaring at Heidi. I knew you were trouble from the moment I saw you. Go to your room at once. No, pleaded Clara. Heidi was only trying to cheer me up. She held Heidi's hand. Please don't send Heidi to her room. We want to have our supper together. There was nothing Mrs. Rottenmeier could do. She had to obey Clara. All right, she said crossly, turning to go. But get that dirty boy out of here now. Mrs. Rottenmeier returned carrying a tray loaded with rich food. Greasy chunks of meat swam in a cream sauce. Clara pushed it around her plate and hardly ate anything. Heidi didn't like it either. I don't get hungry lying in bed, Clara murmured. You'd soon get hungry running up the mountain to Grandfather's hut, Heidi told her. Clara looked sad. But since I've been ill, I can't walk. That's terrible, said Heidi. The warm room and heavy meal were making her feel sleepy. That's Heidi feeling sleepy. She had to go outside to breathe some fresh air. Stale smells hung over the noisy street. Heidi longed for the cool, clean air of the mountain and the soft breeze that made the pine trees rustle. Sometime after Heidi's arrival, the servants started claiming the house was haunted by a ghost. "A white figure floats down the stairs at night," said a male. Sorry, said a maid, not a male. "It's so pale, it's so scary. I heard it groan." The servants were so upset. Mrs. Rottenmeier grew worried. "I must tell Clara's father," she decided. So Mrs. Rottenmeier went to the father and said, "The servants think the house is haunted, sir." And the father, reading his newspaper, said, "Really?"
But the will come after.
"What's that?"
What if he can come after? But
You want to know what?
the father of Heidi will come after.
This is not the father of Heidi, this is the half-father of Clara. He's been told that the house is haunted, but he doesn't believe it. Mr. Sesemann only laughed when he heard the news. "There's no such thing as ghosts," he said. "I'll catch your ghost to prove it." The next night, he waited.
So after the class, Dad's gonna come.
What's that?
After
After what?
class, Daddy will come.
Who's going to come?
After class,
After Clara?
after class, Daddy will come.
Yes, after Clara's daddy will come. That's Clara's daddy there.
But what?
He's waiting at the bottom of the stairs to see if there's a ghost coming down the stairs. Well, let's see what happens. The next night, he waited in the hall at the bottom of the stairs. Heidi came down wearing a white nightgown. She tried to open the locked front door, then sobbed. Do you know what sobbed means?
No.
She cried, tears came out of her eyes
Why?
because she couldn't open the door.
Is it locked?
It was locked. Mr. Sesemann went over to her and saw that she was still fast asleep. She was walking in her sleep, sleepwalking. "Heidi has been sleepwalking," Mr. Sesemann explained to Clara and Mrs. Rottenmeier the next morning. "The poor child is homesick. She's so homesick, her dreams felt real. I think she'd better go home." Mrs. Rottenmeier thought, "Thank goodness she's going." Heidi tells Clara, "I'm going back to grandfather." And Clara says, I'll miss you. Chapter 4, the next chapter, and it's called Heidi Goes Home. The following week, grandfather looked out of the window and he could hardly believe his eyes. What do you think he's seeing?
Heidi.
Heidi's coming home to grandfather. A peculiar procession was stumbling up the mountain slope. Two men were struggling with suitcases.
Oh, there are people here.
All these people coming up the mountain.
Why?
A third hauled a wheelchair. And a fourth carried a child, bundled up in a shawl. The men puffed and panted, their shirts drenched in sweat. "I need a drink. This is steep." Ahead of them all danced Heidi.
Hi.
"At last," he says to grandfather. And grandfather said, "I'm so happy to see you. I never thought I'm so happy to see you. I thought I'd never see you again." She raced up the slope and threw herself into grandfather's arms. Heidi, he cried, you've come back to me. I missed you, Heidi said. Look, Mr. Stresserman has written you a letter to explain. And here's the letter. Dear Sir, Heidi was too homesick to stay with us, but Clara could not bear to say goodbye. I hope you will forgive me for sending her with Heidi to stay for a month. Clara, alas, is still very weak after a long illness. She has no appetite and cannot walk. I hope her visit to you on the mountain will give her new strength. With all my thanks and best wishes, yours sincerely, Hans Stresemann. Scissorman, I think his name is. Grandfather turned to Clara. I'm very pleased to meet you, he said. And thank you for bringing Heidi back to me. You'll soon feel better breathing our mountain air. Grandfather put Clara's wheelchair in the sunshine so that she could see the wonderful view, and he gave her a bowl of fresh milk. Guess who really gave you the milk? Heidi teased, bringing Little Swan over. Because Little Swan's a goat.
Peter?
You'll get to it, we'll see. The goat butted Clara gently until she realized that Little Swan, the goat, wanted to be stroked.
Can I make it play for me?
Sorry?
I want to see it.
What is it, my love?
I'm going here.
What do you want?
I want to put the board for me.
You want to put the blanket on you?
Yeah.
Okay. I'll do that. Oops. Okay, you're very tired, are you? Take your top off. Sit up. Sit up. Then we'll put you to sleep. You must be very sleepy. Oh, that was a bump, wasn't it? Oh, poor thing, bumped his head on the bed. Oh, my little boy. But
Honey, you can avoid it. You could do something to avoid it. You had to expect some bad danger for Eden. It is very bad luck today. I hurt his eyebrow. Eden, 통.
lay down.
통아.
Turn the light up. He wants to sleep. I'm going to carry on. Lay down and I'll tell you the rest. I'll come with the pictures. Lay down, my love. Oh, yeah. Well, that little accident where he bumped his head. So what happened? We were putting the pyjama top on and he bumped his head. But he's feeling better now. A bit like Clara's going to feel better in a minute. So the goat was butting little Clara gently until she realized that Little Swan wanted to be stroked. Clara drank thirstily. This tastes much nicer than Frankfurter milk, she said. Heidi! Heidi! Came a shout. Peter ran up the path to them. I heard you were back, he said to Heidi. Come with me tomorrow, he urged her. Peter, I can't, said Heidi. I have to stay with Clara. Peter gave Clara such a jealous look. You go, Heidi, Clara insisted. All the same, when they set off the next morning, Clara looked sad. I'll be quick, Heidi promised. I just want to climb the ridge where the biggest, bluest flowers grow. Clara watched them go longingly. She would have given anything to be running up with them, to be running up the mountain if she could have done, with her if only her legs were strong enough so she could skip and jump up the mountain. It's all she wanted. I wish you'd come, Heidi told Clara when she returned. I wish you could have come. We watched an eagle soar above our heads, and we did somersaults down the mountain. Clara sighed. Cheer up, Grandfather said, trying to comfort her. The sun has already brought roses to your cheeks, and I'm sure you'll soon feel stronger. I won't leave you again, said Heidi. I won't leave you again. And Clara said, I wish I could walk. From where he stood high on the mountain, Peter could see Heidi and Clara talking together. His heart burned with jealousy. Do you know why he's jealous?
Why?
Because he wants Heidi all for himself. He doesn't want Heidi to have another friend. I wish that girl hadn't come, he thought. Heidi's my friend. I'll make Clara go home. And a plan began to form in his mind. Next chapter is called Peter's Plan. Not Peter Pan, Peter's Plan. A plan is something you plan to do. Before sunrise, next morning, Peter crept to Grandfather's hut. All was quiet and still. Just as Peter had hoped, Clara's wheelchair stood by the door. Noiselessly, he pushed it to the edge of the mountain and rolled it over a steep, stony cliff. The chair hit the rocks with a terrible clatter. An endless echo followed its fall, bang, clang, again and again and again. Peering over the cliff, Peter saw that the jagged rocks had smashed the wheelchair into 1,000 pieces. Peter looked at what he had done and felt guilty and fled. When he arrived at the hut for the goats, Heidi told Peter about Clara's chair. The wind must have caught it, she said. Grandfather has to carry Clara everywhere. Then Clara will have to go home, won't she? Peter demanded. Aha, murmured Grandfather. I think I know who blew that puff of wind, said Grandfather, looking at Peter. Grandfather knows that Peter did it. Heidi was shocked. Did you do it, Peter? She asked sharply. Peter went red. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry, he stammered. I wanted her to go. You don't have time for me now. Peter, you must hate me, said Clara. You think I've taken Heidi away from you. Never mind, Heidi interrupted. We can all still be friends. But Grandfather shook his head. Mr. Saserman may not be so forgiving, he said. Clara's chair is still broken. If only Clara could walk, said Heidi. I do feel stronger, Clara whispered. Perhaps I should try. She edged herself forward and put her slender feet on the ground. Grandfather took hold of her hands and helped her to stand. My legs feel so weak, said Clara, trembling. Be brave, said Grandfather. Slowly, Clara put one foot in front of another.
What?
She's starting to walk. She doesn't need the wheelchair anymore. Clara wobbled, but Grandfather supported her. Rest now, he ordered. You can try again tomorrow. Every day, Clara walked a little more. Hungry from the exercise and fresh mountain air, she wolfed down huge meals. Strength flowed into her, and she tingled with energy. Won't Father be amazed, she thought. She's walking at last. The next chapter, chapter 6, is called A Surprise for Mr. Sesamon. A few weeks later, Mr. Sesamon arrived for Clara. He hardly recognized his daughter with her glowing face, bright eyes, and thick, shiny hair. When Clara stood up, he was astonished, and when she walked up to him, he had to sit down. Is it really you? He said. I can't believe it. You're walking. Isn't it wonderful? Laughed Clara. Grandfather and Heidi have made it happen. And Peter, Grandfather put in, his eyes twinkling. You did it, Clara, said Heidi. It was your hard work. It's a miracle, Mr. Sesamon beamed. Clara, I'm proud of you. Thank you, and thank you, everyone, said Mr. Sesamon. That's Clara's daddy. You must come back to the mountain whenever you want, said Grandfather. And Heidi said to Clara, Clara, you must come back to the mountain whenever you want. And Clara said, and you must come to Frankfurt, Peter too. We'll find the ragged boy again and dance. Come here, man. When Clara and her father had gone, Heidi and Grandfather went outside to watch the sunset. The sky and mountains shone red gold, just like Heidi's first evening. It's beautiful, said Grandfather. Once I was sad and lonely, he told Heidi, but you made me a very happy man. And that's the end of the story. And that from then on, Grandfather and Heidi lived happily ever after in the mountains, and Clara came to see them often and enjoyed the mountain air. And that's the end of the story.